On a February morning in 1990, the cold light of Santa Clarita, California, found a house where one of rock and roll's most fragile voices had gone quiet. Shannon, the man who had once stood at the very peak of the charts with a song called Runaway, was gone, taken by his own hand in the middle of a life that had long since lost its melody. The golden echo of that #1 hit stood in cruel contrast to the silence he left behind, a silence that seemed to swallow the sunny California landscape. But the true weight of that winter morning has never been explained by the music he made or the fame he lost, for the secret buried in his final days was a debt that no amount of money could ever settle. Shannon was born Charles Westover on December 30, 1934, in Grand Rapids, Michigan, a city of furniture factories and quiet, industrious streets. He was not born into music, nor into privilege, but into the kind of ordinary American middle-class life that would later make his voice seem all the more extraordinary. Before he ever stepped near a microphone, he was a paratrooper in the United States Army, serving during the Korean War. He trained to jump out of aircraft and into combat, a fact that seems almost absurd when set against the fragile, aching tenor he would later commit to vinyl. The America of the late 1950s was a landscape of polished chrome and newly built highways, but its radio waves were still churning out the same formulaic pop confections that had dominated the decade. Rock and roll was beginning to splinter into something rawer, yet the industry still preferred its stars clean-cut and its songs predictable. For a young man with a name like Charles Westover, the path to that world was not a straight line. He carried his discharge papers from the army, and a head full of melodies that did not yet have a shape, wandering through local bands in Michigan, trying to find a sound that felt like his own. He did not have the swagger of Elvis or the polished sheen of a boy band idol. He had something else, a trembling vulnerability that sat uncomfortably in the chest and refused to be smoothed over. It was the sound of a man who had been trained for violence but was built for tenderness, and it made him an oddity everywhere he went. He changed his name to Shannon, partly to escape the awkwardness of his birth name, partly to invent a persona that could carry the weight of his ambitions. But the name change did not alter the core of what he was, a quiet, determined man from the Midwest who wanted to be heard. He met Max Crook in the late 1950s, a keyboard player with a fascination for electronic instruments that were still considered novelty gadgets. Crook was as eccentric as Shannon was reserved, and their partnership became an unlikely marriage of imagination and grit. They played small clubs together, grinding through sets of covers and originals, none of which set the world on fire. What they were building, though, was a chemistry that would eventually produce something entirely unprecedented, a sound that would not be born until they stopped trying to imitate everyone else. The music industry of that era was a machine built on conformity, and it had little use for a singer whose voice cracked with emotion and a keyboardist who fiddled with circuits in his spare time. And yet, it was exactly that mismatch, the paratrooper-turned-crooner, the technician-turned-visionary, that made them impossible to ignore once they finally stepped into a studio. The men who would later hear him sing for the first time did not know what to make of him. He was not loud, not flashy, not anything the industry had taught them to expect. He was just a man with a fragile, gorgeous voice that seemed to come from somewhere far deeper than the glossy surface of the era. He was a soldier who had learned to fall from the sky, and he was about to teach the world a lesson about what rock and roll could truly hold. The story of Runaway begins not in a gleaming studio, but in the frozen grip of a Michigan January. It was the first month of 1961, and the band had pulled into Battle Creek for a short stand of dates, unaware that popular music was about to be permanently altered within its city limits. This was the moment where a song would emerge fully formed, a spectral melody born from a mundane tour stop, and a homemade instrument that sounded like nothing else on earth. The creative spark that ignited this legendary track was not a solitary flash of genius, but a collaboration between two very different musicians. The song's signature sound came from an unlikely source, the hands of keyboardist Max Crook and his self-built electronic organ, the Musitron. Along with Shannon, Crook is credited as a co-writer, and his invention, a modified clavier line, provided the haunting, otherworldly solo that would become the track's defining DNA. This unique, almost alien tone was so distinctive that it could not be mistaken for any other record of the era. It was a sound that seemed to come from the future, cutting through the airwaves with a strange, melancholic beauty. It was this very instrument that provided the accompaniment for the first fateful recording session in New York. Crook later recounted to BBC News that Shannon sang Runaway over a rough demo track at Bell Sound Studios, pouring his heart into a performance that left the room in stunned silence. When the final note faded, no one spoke a word. The engineers were frozen, completely caught off guard by the raw, fragile power they had just witnessed. Then the silence broke, replaced by applause as they demanded he perform it again, a total of 5 times, simply because they could not believe the voice they were hearing was real. Each take was a different iteration of that same electric spine-tingling sensation. This wasn't just a well-crafted pop song, it was an event, a collision of a vulnerable vocal with the eerie wail of the Musitron. The studio had expected a run-of-the-mill session, but they were witnessing the birth of a masterpiece that would define a generation's ache for lost love. It must have felt like catching lightning in a bottle, a moment where every element, every note and every breath aligned with a perfect, devastating grace. The song they recorded that day wasn't just a hit, it was a monument built from pure, unadulterated feeling. The spring of 1961 found America on the cusp of a new decade, and at the very centre of its pop culture stood a song that seemed to come from somewhere else entirely. Runaway had arrived, and its ascent was not gradual but a violent, immediate capture of the nation's attention. The record's climb up the charts was relentless, a rocket launch that left the rest of the field trailing in its exhaust. Within weeks of its release, the single had smashed through the glass ceiling of the top 40 and driven itself to the very summit of the Billboard Hot 100. The magazine's archives from that year confirmed the victory, a #1 hit that seemed to define the moment. Then came the confirmation of a deeper, more commercial triumph, as the Recording Industry Association of America certified the single as a gold record, a designation reserved for sales of over 1 million copies. This wasn't just a fleeting radio hit, it was a physical phenomenon, a piece of plastic that hundreds of thousands of people felt compelled to own. But the numbers only tell a fraction of the story, for the cultural landscape of 1961 was one of anxious optimism, a nation shaking off the conformity of the 50s. The airwaves were filled with the polished pop of the Brill Building and the romantic crooning of teen idols, a clean and predictable soundscape. Into this pristine environment, Charles Westover, the paratrooper from Grand Rapids, detonated a bomb of raw, trembling emotion. His voice, which D.A. Pennebaker would later describe as one of the most vulnerable and beautiful in rock and roll, was a shock to the system. It was a sound so unlike anything else on the radio that it demanded you stop what you were doing and listen, a fragile high-wire act of a performance that felt both dangerous and deeply personal. The critical reception was as stunned as the public's. Here was a song that didn't fit the formula, a record with an eerie, otherworldly instrumental break, and a vocal that cracked with a sincerity that felt almost invasive. It was a sound of a man on the edge, and the public couldn't get enough of it. The song was an anthem for the heartbroken and the restless, a testament to the kind of desperate longing that teenage America was just beginning to understand. It was the perfect soundtrack for a generation learning to feel its own feelings with a new intensity. For Shannon, the transformation was immediate and absolute. The man who had been struggling to make ends meet in the small clubs of Michigan was suddenly a national star, wanted for interviews, live television appearances, and constant touring. The financial reality of his former life evaporated as the checks from 1 million sales began to pour in, replacing poverty with an intoxicating taste of wealth. He was no longer an unknown, but the man with the strangest and most compelling voice in the country, a whiplash change for someone who had so recently been sleeping in the back of a van. Yet this dizzying ascent was built on a foundation that was already cracking, a financial contract that would later prove to be a millstone. The very structure of the music industry, with its predatory publishing deals, ensured that the lion's share of the wealth would never reach his pockets. Did he realize that this meteoric rise, this peak of 1 million sales and a gold disc, was the moment that his future was being sold out from under him? The glory was real, but the bill for that glory was already being compiled, ready to be delivered to a man who would never truly be able to pay it. The quiet triumph of Runaway had barely cooled before Del Shannon committed an act of audacity that still echoes through rock history. While America was still swooning to his falsetto, he became the first American artist to cover a song by the Beatles. The track was From Me to You, a jaunty slice of Mersey beat that had yet to conquer the States. He recorded it with a vigour that suggested he understood something the rest of the country didn't. His version of the song, released in June of 1963, was a bold declaration of faith in a band most Americans had never heard of. Yet the commercial response was a crushing silence, with the single stalling at number 123 on the Billboard chart. The artistic merit was undeniable, but the public had already moved on, a stark omen of the fragility of fame. This remarkable gamble, however, was not a shot in the dark. Just a year earlier, in 1962, Shannon had been handed a demo of a song called Love Me Do by a then unknown group from Liverpool. While other executives heard a quaint novelty, Shannon heard the future. He predicted, with an almost embarrassing certainty, that this band would become the biggest thing in the world. His foresight proved to be spectacularly accurate, cementing his reputation as a visionary with an ear for raw talent. It was a gift that would define his legacy as much as any record he cut. But in the brutal economy of the music business, being right about others rarely pays your own bills. He was witnessing the landscape shift beneath his feet, and he was smart enough to see the new tide rolling in. The irony was that the very success of the British invasion, which he had so presciently anticipated, was about to wash him out of the mainstream. The Beatles and their compatriots took over American airwaves, leaving many of the homegrown stars scrambling for relevance. After his contract with Big Top Records expired, Shannon made a move he hoped would restore his momentum, signing with Liberty Records in 1963. It was a fresh start on paper, a chance to reinvent himself within a changing industry. However, the singles he released under this new banner consistently failed to crack the top 20. The records were good, but the audience was no longer listening with the same devotion. His reign at the summit of pop had lasted less than 2 years, a dizzying and brutal fall from grace. So what do you do when the world that once adored your voice suddenly turns its attention elsewhere? For Del Shannon, the answer was to keep moving, but the ground was already beginning to crumble beneath him. He had proven his genius both as a performer and a talent scout, yet neither could shield him from the fickle nature of the charts. The man who had once been the future of rock and roll was now being politely shown the door. His great eye for talent had not been enough to protect his own career, leaving only a lingering question about the price of a fleeting perfect moment of glory. The seeds of his financial ruin and his crushing personal turmoil were now beginning to take root in the fertile soil of his decline. The money came in faster than a man from Grand Rapids could ever have imagined, and it went out just as quickly. After Runaway seized the top of the charts, Del Shannon traded his modest Midwestern life for the full Hollywood fantasy, buying a sprawling mansion in Los Angeles, a fleet of luxury cars, and hosting parties that became the stuff of local legend. His former manager later recalled to Rolling Stone magazine that the singer seemed determined to prove he belonged among the elite, spending on grand gestures as though the hits would never stop coming. The champagne flowed, the guest list glittered, and the bills piled up quietly in the background, unnoticed by a man who had spent his 20s in a military uniform and his early 30s in relative anonymity. He was, in every visible way, living the dream that every struggling musician in America was chasing, and yet the foundation beneath him was already beginning to crack. The cruelest irony of Del Shannon's financial ruin was that the very song which made him famous was also the one that paid him the least. Despite Runaway becoming a global smash and selling over 1 million copies, Shannon saw only a fraction of the publishing royalties because of the standard but severely disadvantageous contracts that dominated the music industry at the time. As Adam Summers documents in his book The $1 Million Voice, the singer had signed away a significant portion of his songwriting rights to his publisher, a deal that was common practice in the late 50s and early 60s, but one that would prove catastrophic as his career began to cool. The machinery of the hit-making industry had been built to enrich the labels and the publishers, not the artists who actually created the sounds that filled the airwaves. Every jukebox play and every radio spin of Runaway generated revenue, but only a trickle of that river ever found its way back to the man whose trembling falsetto had made it all possible. By the end of the decade, the trickle had turned into a flood of red ink, and the federal government wanted its share. According to bankruptcy court records from 1990, Del Shannon owed the IRS hundreds of thousands of dollars in back taxes, a sum that had compounded with penalties and interest over years of missed payments. He had made money, certainly, but he had spent it even faster, and the taxman does not care about mansion mortgages or the cost of keeping up appearances. The singer found himself trapped in a classic American nightmare, earning enough to look wealthy, but never enough to actually keep any of it. He had a name that was still recognized, a hit that was still played, and yet he was systematically bleeding money from every direction, with no clear path back to solvency. It was his longtime business associate, Bob Keane, the founder of Delphi Records, who finally confronted him with the hard truth and offered what seemed like the only way out. In a 2000 interview with the classic band's website, Keane recalled the moment he sat Shannon down and proposed that he sell the rights to Runaway to settle his debts once and for all. The offer was straightforward: hand over the song that had defined his life, and the financial albatross around his neck would finally be lifted. But Shannon's reaction was immediate and absolute. He looked at Keane and said, with a certainty that left no room for argument, "That song is my mother. If I steal from my mother, then what am I?" He would rather carry the burden of his debt into the ground than part with the one thing that connected him to his own artistic soul, and in that refusal, he sealed his tragic fate. He was not simply being stubborn or sentimental about it. For Del Shannon, Runaway was not a product to be liquidated, but the very proof that he had existed, that a shy kid from Michigan who once jumped out of airplanes had somehow reached the entire world with his voice. To sell it would have been to admit that his entire career had been reduced to a transaction, a line item on a balance sheet, a piece of inventory to be auctioned off to the highest bidder. The mansion could go, the cars could go, the parties were long gone, but the song was him, and without it he would have been nothing but a man with debts, a man with a past, a man who had once been somebody. He chose instead to hold on to the only thing of real value he had ever possessed, even as it dragged him deeper into a financial abyss from which there was no climbing out. And so the man who had given the world one of the most perfect pop songs ever written spent his final years protecting it, the way a parent protects a child, even as the weight of everything he refused to surrender was slowly crushing him. There was a second life hidden inside that house in Santa Clarita, one that unfolded after midnight when the rest of the world had finally gone quiet. His daughter Kim would sometimes wake in the small hours and hear the creak of a floorboard, the soft click of a latch, and she knew her father was downstairs, sitting alone in the kitchen with the old suitcase he never allowed anyone else to touch. Inside that battered valise, Kim later told People magazine in 1990, were all the unpaid bills he could no longer face, letters from creditors and final notices that had stacked up for years, and he would open it only when he was certain no one could see him. He would sit there for hours, staring at the evidence of his own ruin, never saying a word, never asking for help, carrying the weight of it in absolute silence until the sky began to lighten. By 1989, the financial pressure had become so crushing that Shannon began telling close friends he was considering bankruptcy, a word that terrified him more than the debts themselves. He threatened to file, according to People magazine, but he never actually submitted the paperwork, choosing instead to borrow more money from friends just to keep up the appearance that everything was still under control. He was a man who had once stood at the very top of the music industry, and now he was quietly drowning in obligations he could not meet, all while smiling for the cameras and pretending the good years had never ended. The public never saw the panic, never saw the sleepless nights, never saw the way he flinched whenever a phone call came in from an unknown number. He had built an entire life on the sound of his own voice, and he could not bear to let anyone hear it crack. There was another wound beneath the financial one, a deeper and far more personal terror that had been growing inside him for years. Only 3 months before his death, Shannon had been diagnosed with glossophobia, the crippling fear of performing in front of an audience, according to the BBC Music Review in 1990. A condition that struck him with particular cruelty because his entire career depended on standing in front of crowds and singing. The man who had once commanded stadiums and arena stages, who had sent his voice into the radios of millions, now felt his chest tighten and his palms go cold at the thought of walking into a room full of people staring back at him. He was a performer who could no longer perform, a singer who had lost his nerve, and the irony of it seemed to hollow him out from the inside. His doctor had prescribed medication for the anxiety, but the diagnosis itself had already delivered a fatal blow to the last remaining piece of his identity. The science around him painted an even darker picture than the one he could see. Research from the American Psychological Association has shown that social isolation is a stronger predictor of suicide than clinical depression itself, and Shannon had spent years building walls between himself and everyone who might have helped him. He had withdrawn from his old friends, stopped returning calls from his former bandmates, and retreated into the basement studio of his home, where he would sit alone with his memories and his regrets. He was surrounded by people who loved him, but he had become an island, unreachable and untouchable, and no amount of affection from the outside could penetrate the fortress he had built around his own heart. The tragedy is that he was not alone in the world. He was alone inside himself, and that is a far more dangerous kind of solitude. The most devastating evidence of his unravelling came on the night of December 10th, 1989, at the Coconut Grove Theatre in Los Angeles, a venue that should have felt familiar, intimate and safe. He had agreed to a comeback performance, a chance to remind everyone why they had once loved him, and the room was filled with 400 faithful fans who had come to hear the old songs. He walked on stage, picked up his guitar, and began to play Runaway, the song that had made him a legend, the song that had given him everything, and then taken it all away. And then mid-verse, in front of the entire room, he stopped. He looked out at those 400 faces, a fraction of the 10,000 who had once packed stadiums to hear him sing, and he told them the truth he had been carrying for 30 years. "I wish I had never written that song," he said, according to the LA Times. "It swallowed me whole." He set down the guitar, walked off the stage, and never returned. The man who had once sung to 10,000 people could no longer face 400, and in that moment the distance between who he had been and who he had become was impossible to ignore. The applause that followed him off that stage must have sounded like an accusation, each clap a reminder of every show he had ever played, every stage he had ever conquered, and every promise he had ever made to himself about the future. He had been a soldier, a paratrooper, a man who had jumped out of airplanes into the chaos of war, and yet he could not find the courage to walk back into a room full of people who only wanted to love him. The isolation had done its work, the bills had done their damage, and the fear had taken the final piece of him that was still holding on. He went home to his suitcase, to his silent kitchen, to the long dark hours before dawn, and the world outside never knew the depth of the war he was losing inside his own head. By the time the snow began to fall on Santa Clarita, Del Shannon had been carrying a chemical passenger in his bloodstream for weeks, a relic of an older school of medicine that promised relief by rearranging the very wiring of the brain. His ex-wife, Stephanie Westover, told Time magazine in 1990 that he was taking a tricyclic antidepressant prescribed by his own doctor, a drug class that had been the standard answer to despair long before the gentler SSRIs arrived. The irony is that these medications, designed to lift a patient out of the darkness, work by a mechanism that can, in the most vulnerable moments, throw open the door they were meant to lock. They block the reuptake of serotonin and norepinephrine, flooding the synaptic gaps with hope-inducing chemicals, but that sudden surge is a double-edged blade that cuts both ways. According to the Mayo Clinic's 2022 analysis, this flood creates a window of unnatural euphoria, a false high that strips away the brain's natural brakes precisely when a person feels most unburdened. The National Institutes of Health, publishing through its PubMed Central Archive in 2019, documented that these older drugs can cause a dangerous side effect, a reduction in inhibition that actually increases suicidal risk, especially in the very young and the very old. For Shannon, who at 56 was already teetering on the edge of a precipice, built from unpaid bills and whispered failures, this pharmacological loosening of his last restraints was like removing the guardrail on a mountain road. He was not simply sad, he was chemically propelled into a state where the impulse to act, to end the hum that never stopped, could outrun his own judgment. The timeline of his final weeks shows a man who seemed to be climbing out of his hole, booking studio time, talking about new material, yet his friend Paul Freeman noted how Shannon would swing from manic plans to silent despair within a single phone call. That volatility, the hallmark of someone riding a TCA's emotional roller coaster, was the calm before the storm, a fake spring that fooled everyone around him into believing the worst had passed. It is a cruel trick of these medications that the peak of their effectiveness often coincides with the peak of their danger, when the body has adjusted enough to feel energy, but the mind has not yet built the walls to contain it. The debt, the isolation, the shame of a man who had once been number one now playing to empty rooms, all of that was still there, but now it was filtered through a brain that had lost its capacity for hesitation. How many of us have felt that sudden burst of clarity, that terrifying moment when the fog lifts just enough to show us the full scale of our ruin? Shannon was told these pills would help him, that they would smooth out the jagged edges of his anxiety, but instead they gave him the will to act on thoughts he had previously been able to push aside. The medical literature is coldly specific about this paradox. Drugs meant to preserve life can, in a narrow window, become the very tool of its ending, and the patient never knows which direction the gamble will go. By the time his daughter Kim noticed her father seemed almost cheerful, almost at peace, she had no reason to fear that this was the most dangerous sign of all. His body was a battlefield where three armies converged, the crushing weight of a career that had slipped away, the toxic chemistry of a drug that was supposed to be his salvation, and the solitary silence of a man who carried his bills in a suitcase so no one would see them. The tricyclic antidepressant did not create his despair. It simply removed the final barrier between the despair and the act, greasing the rails that led to the gun cabinet. When the Los Angeles County coroner wrote down suicide on the report, they were recording the mechanics of the death, but the true cause was a perfect storm of financial ruin, social isolation, and a prescription that promised help but delivered only acceleration. And here is the chilling part that medical science has only recently begun to whisper. The very pill that was meant to be his life raft was the one that pulled him under, not because it was poison, but because it gave a drowning man the energy to stop swimming. The drug saved his mind for just long enough to let it destroy him, and in that final, chemically induced moment of false peace, he pulled the trigger on a man who had just been told he was getting better. What good is an antidepressant if it wakes you from the nightmare, only to find yourself still standing in the burning house? The phone call came at 2 in the morning, a time when the world is silent and the mind refuses to follow. Paul Freeman, a music journalist who had known Del Shannon for years, picked up the receiver to hear the singer's voice on the other end of the line. It was January 1990, and Shannon was restless, explaining that he had just stumbled upon an idea for a new song. He confided to Freeman that he could not sleep, terrified that the melody forming in his head would vanish before he could capture it on paper, as if the creative spark itself was a fragile thing that might slip away and take him with it. That phone call, later recounted in Freeman's memoir Fame and Failure, now reads like the final flicker of a man reaching out in the only way he knew how. The song he was so desperate to preserve never surfaced, and within a month the voice that had once commanded the airwaves would fall silent forever. On the morning of February 8, 1990, in the quiet suburban sprawl of Santa Clarita, California, Del Shannon was found dead in his home, a hunting rifle by his side. He was 56 years old, an age that should have promised decades more of music. Yet the Los Angeles County coroner's report would formally conclude that the wound was self-inflicted, a verdict of suicide that left no room for ambiguity in the official records. The Los Angeles Times carried the story with the kind of measured disbelief that accompanies the death of someone who seemed to have so much life left in him. But what made the tragedy so maddening to those who loved him was the absence of any final word. Investigators scoured the house and found no suicide note, no explanation, no parting message that might have offered a glimpse into the chaos of his final hours. The New York Times would later note that the lack of a note sparked bitter debate among family and friends, some insisting that the act was not a clear-eyed decision, but the result of a mind clouded by medication and despair. How could a man who still dreamed of new songs, who called friends in the dead of night to share his creative terror, simply decide to end everything without a single goodbye? The answer, perhaps, lies in the silence he maintained for so many years. His daughter Kim Westover, speaking to People magazine in the weeks after his death, painted a portrait of a man who suffered in private, hidden away from the world that only knew him as a hitmaker. She described how her father would retreat to the small home studio tucked deep in the basement, a space where no one could witness what he was feeling. And there, alone in the dark, he would play the song that had made him famous, the very track that had launched his career, and he would break down sobbing, the weight of his own creation pressing down on him. She remembered how he would say, with a voice full of something between resignation and sorrow, that people had heard him sing, but they had never once heard him speak. It was a devastating admission from a man who had spent his entire career communicating through melody and lyrics, yet who felt utterly unheard as a human being. The irony was crushing. The world had played Runaway millions of times, had danced to it, had loved it, but the man behind it remained an invisible figure, choking on his own isolation. The coroner's report used clinical language, referring to the gunshot wound as self-inflicted, but no document could capture the slow accumulation of despair that led to that single moment. The debt, the fear of bankruptcy, the stage fright that had recently been diagnosed, the pills that were supposed to help but only dulled his edges, they all converged on that winter morning like a storm that had been building for years. He had told Bob Keane that Runaway was his mother, that selling its rights would be like stealing from the woman who gave him life, a refusal that preserved his artistic soul but sealed his financial fate. So the final act was deliberate in its execution but maddeningly ambiguous in its intent. The shotgun was chosen, the location was his own home, and the timing was a quiet weekday morning, all of which pointed to a man who knew exactly what he was doing. But the absence of a note, the lingering plans for new music, the desperate phone calls to friends, they all suggested a man who was still fighting, still searching for a way out that was not oblivion. The Los Angeles Times article ended with a simple question that has haunted everyone who knew the story. Was this the act of someone who had given up, or the final symptom of a disease that had been poisoning him for years? And there, in that contradiction, lies the deepest tragedy of Del Shannon. He was declared a suicide by the official record, a death with purpose and finality, yet he left behind no message for his daughter, no explanation for his friends, no closing statement for the fans who had carried his song in their hearts for 3 decades. The man who had poured his longing into music that connected with millions could not find the words to say goodbye to the few people who truly mattered to him. The investigation closed, the case was filed, and the world moved on, but the question remains an open wound. How did a man who spent his life chasing the perfect way to express love and loss end his days with such a brutal and wordless exit? The record refused to die with the man who made it. Less than a year after the shotgun blast echoed through that Santa Clarita home, Runaway was re-released and climbed back into the UK top 10. A ghost single returning to the charts to haunt a world that had already moved on. The official charts company confirmed its resurrection in 1991, a stark reminder that the public's appetite for the song had outlived its creator by a wide margin. It was as if the melody itself had shrugged off the mortal coil and stepped back into the light, ready to be adored all over again. That same stubborn vitality persists in the digital age, where the song now lives a second, even more astonishing life. According to Spotify's own chart data, Runaway has amassed over 65 million legitimate streams as of 2025, a figure that proves the hit's cultural grip has not loosened in 65 years. A teenager in Tokyo or a student in Sao Paulo can summon that haunting clavier line solo with a tap of a thumb, connecting to a moment of American pop history they never witnessed firsthand. The song has become a kind of sonic monument, endlessly played and perpetually rediscovered. In 2002, the nation itself decided that this was no mere pop trifle, but a piece of cultural heritage worthy of permanent protection. The Library of Congress added the original Runaway recording to its National Recording Registry, a collection reserved for works deemed to possess significance to the cultural history of the United States. The honor placed Shannon's humble 3-minute single alongside the most important audio documents in the nation's memory, granting it a form of immortality that no chart position could ever bestow. The critics, too, have come around in ways they never did during his lifetime. Modern tastemakers at Pitchfork, in a 2022 retrospective, argued that Shannon's later cuts like Keep Searchin', Follow the Sun, exerted a direct and powerful influence on the garage rock and psych pop revival of the early 2000s. They looked back at his body of work and saw not a washed-up one-hit wonder, but a forward-thinking artist whose sonic experiments were decades ahead of their time. The recognition is profound, yet it arrives with the bitter irony of being entirely posthumous. A laurel placed on a grave rather than a crown on a living head. The stark contrast between the song's eternal life and the man's forgotten struggles prompted a haunting observation from a British newspaper. The Independent, reflecting on Shannon's fate in a retrospective piece, coined a chilling phrase: "Commercial obscurity was a drowning pain, more dangerous and more corrosive than physical death itself." It is a piercing thought for any artist contemplating the fragility of fame. What does it mean, after all, to have created something that outlives you 100-fold, when the financial and psychological weight of that creation crushed you long ago? Can a legacy be measured in streams and archive entries if the person who made it felt abandoned by the very world that now celebrates him? The song is eternal, and yet the man who poured his heart into it has faded into a strange half-remembered footnote. He gave the world an anthem for the lovelorn, a perfect distillation of yearning, and the world paid him back by forgetting the debt it owed him while his bills went unpaid. The melody plays on, a relentless ghost in the machine of popular culture, but the face behind it grows fainter with each passing year. Perhaps that is the cruelest twist of all. To create something so timeless that it no longer needs you, and to be erased by the very immortality you forged. In 2005, the Michigan Rock and Roll Legends Hall of Fame formally enshrined Del Shannon, a curious honor that felt less like a celebration and more like a late apology. The plaque acknowledged the man from Grand Rapids, yet the recognition arrived 15 years after his funeral and decades after the royalties had dried up. It was a gesture of remembrance, but the world had already moved on to newer sounds and fresher faces. The Hall of Fame could offer a name on a wall, but it could not restore the fortune or the peace he had lost. Then, in 2010, the city government of Grand Rapids proposed a bronze statue of Shannon for the downtown area, a permanent tribute to its most famous musical son. The plan seemed perfect, a homecoming carved in metal, until the project stalled indefinitely due to a lack of public funding. The commission had the will, but the coffers were empty, and the statue never left the blueprint stage. So the man who once filled stadiums was left without a single monument in his own hometown, a silence louder than any applause. His own daughter, Kim Westover, tried to change that narrative in March 2020 by founding the Del Shannon Memorial Fund to support young artists facing financial hardship. She poured her energy into keeping his memory alive as a helping hand, not just a sad headline, but the fund survived only 2 years due to a lack of sponsorship. The Santa Clarita Signal reported its quiet dissolution, a final footnote in a story already crowded with endings. Even the effort to build a legacy out of compassion could not outlast the indifference of a public that had already turned the page. It is a brutal pattern that extends far beyond one man's tragedy, as researchers at Stanford University found that 60% of American celebrities experience a sudden income drop of over 50% within 2 or 3 years of their career peak. The study, published by the Economics Department in 2021, painted a picture of an industry that chews up its stars and then spits them out when the spotlight dims. These artists are left to navigate a free fall without a safety net, their value measured only by their last hit. Is it any wonder that so many of them vanish into obscurity, their struggles hidden behind closed doors? The writer Adam Summers digs into this phenomenon in his book, The Tyranny of the Hit, arguing that the one-hit wonder label did more psychological damage to Del Shannon than his antidepressants ever could. Summers contends that reducing a lifetime of craft to a single song creates a prison of expectation, where every new note is compared to a ghost. The label strips away the human complexity and leaves only a caricature, a man forever chasing a moment he can never recreate. It is a cruel simplification that kills the spirit long before the body gives up. In the end, the pattern is painfully clear. When a star falls, the world tends to look away and the memory of them fades like an old photograph left in the sun. The very industry that once celebrated them becomes the engine of their erasure, repackaging their pain as a cautionary tale while moving on to the next bright thing. Del Shannon received a plaque, a stalled statue proposal, and a failed fund. Gestures that all pointed to a legacy half-remembered and poorly kept. The hit lived on, but the man who made it was left to wither in the shadows of his own creation. That winter morning in Santa Clarita, with the California hills quiet under the grey February sky, the suitcase of unpaid bills stayed exactly where his daughter always found it, hidden in the back of the closet, its weight carried alone in the dark hours before dawn. The debt that followed Charles Westover to the end was never really about the money at all. It was about the silence, the performance of a life that looked fine from the outside while the walls quietly closed in. His story is not a rare one, and that is the part that should stop us cold. The World Health Organization records more than 700,000 lives lost to suicide every single year, which means somewhere in the world, a person dies this way roughly once every 40 seconds. Among young people aged 15 to 29, suicide ranks as the 4th leading cause of death, a statistic that names a crisis we still struggle to speak about out loud. Shannon belonged to an older generation, but his isolation was not a product of age. It was a product of a culture that taught him to keep the valise shut and the smile steady. The music industry that built him also quietly abandoned him, and the numbers tell a story of their own. The International Federation of the Phonographic Industry reported that global recorded music revenue reached $26.2 billion in 2022, a staggering sum that suggests enormous wealth circulating through the same system that left a legend like Shannon owing hundreds of thousands in back taxes. The share that actually reaches the artists who create the work sits at just 21% of that total, a figure that explains why so many careers follow the same arc from triumph to ruin. When the hits stop coming, the machine simply moves on, and the person who once filled stadiums is left to reconcile the roar of 10,000 voices with the silence of an empty calendar. We remember the songs, but we forget the singers, and that forgetting carries a cost that no royalty statement can ever capture. So here is the question that lingers after the coroner's report and the reissues and the Hall of Fame inductions. How many people are sitting right now with their own suitcase of unpaid bills, their own fear of being forgotten, their own belief that the burden is theirs alone to carry? The answer is closer than you think, and it might even be looking back at you from the mirror. If any part of this story feels familiar, if you have ever felt the walls closing in or wondered whether anyone would notice if you disappeared, please understand that you are not the exception and you are not alone. The bravest thing Shannon never managed to do was open that valise in front of another human being, and it cost him everything. So do not let the silence win. Tell someone, reach out, let the weight be shared, because the debt that matters most is the one we never have to pay alone.